I wasn't sure if I should share this story, but I feel like I have to. If it stops even one person from making the same mistake I did, then it's worth it. What happened to me on my RV trip through California wasn't some supernatural horror. It was real, and it nearly cost me my life. Last summer, I decided to take an RV trip through California. I'd been working non-stop, stressed out, and I thought this would be the perfect way to unplug. No hotels, no schedules, just me and the open road. It sounded perfect. I rented a used RV from a guy I found on a peer-to-peer rental site. It wasn't anything fancy, but it ran well, and I didn't think much of the quirks. The worn-out seats, the old smell, the way the generator would stutter before it fully kicked in. It was cheap, and I figured I was just getting what I paid for. My plan was simple: drive up the coast, camp out in a few national parks, and just enjoy the quiet. The first few days were amazing. Big Sur, Yosemite, everything was perfect. But then, about a week into my trip, things started to go wrong. It began with small stuff. The RV's interior lights flickered randomly at night, which I chalked up to old wiring. Then the fridge cut out. I lost some food, but again, I figured it was just part of renting an older vehicle. Then, about 10 days into my trip, while driving through a remote area of Northern California, my engine started sputtering. I pulled over at a small gas station, checked under the hood, and found nothing obviously wrong. But the RV wouldn't start back up. I was stranded. There was no cell service, and the gas station was just a tiny shack with a single pump and an old man sitting out front. I asked if there was a mechanic nearby, but he just gave me a slow shake of his head. "No mechanics round here," he said. "Nearest one's in the next town, about 50 miles up." That's when a guy in an old truck pulled up and overheard my situation. He looked like he worked construction. Dusty jeans, a sunburnt face, calloused hands. He said he knew engines and offered to take a look. I should have said no. I should have trusted my gut. But I was in the middle of nowhere with no other options. He climbed into the RV, checked under the hood, and then told me he could fix it, but he needed a part from his house just a few miles away. "I can give you a ride," he said. Something felt off. His eyes didn't match his friendly tone. But again, I had no choice. I locked up the RV and got into his truck. That was the biggest mistake of my life. We drove in silence at first, winding down dirt roads that led away from the highway. The farther we went, the more I realized I had no idea where we were. Then, he started talking. "You're lucky I came by," he said. "Bad things happen to people who break down out here." I tried to play along, acting like I wasn't nervous, but my heart was pounding. Finally, he pulled up to a small, run-down trailer deep in the woods. There was no garage, no sign of car parts. Just an old trailer and a pile of junk scattered around the yard. "Wait here," he said, and went inside. The second he shut the door, I grabbed the door handle. Locked. I checked my pockets. No phone. I'd left it in the RV. Then I noticed something chilling. On the ground outside the truck, near the trailer's steps, was a pile of broken phones. Panic hit me like a punch to the chest. I was in trouble. I took a deep breath, forced myself to think. Then I spotted something. His keys, still in the ignition. I didn't hesitate. I lunged over the console, twisted the keys, and the truck roared to life. The door to the trailer burst open. He ran out, screaming, but I slammed my foot on the gas and tore out of there, kicking up dust as he sprinted after me. I don't even remember the drive back. I just kept going, heart racing, until I saw the gas station again. The old man was still sitting there, watching as I pulled in, breathless, shaking. "You met Rick," he said calmly. "You're lucky." I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my things, called a tow truck from the station's landline, and got the hell out of there. Later, I looked up missing persons cases in the area. There were dozens: hikers, travelers, people passing through. Some had never been found. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't taken that truck, but I do know this: never, ever break down in the wrong place, and never, under any circumstances, take a ride from a stranger. I made that mistake, and I barely got out alive. I thought an RV trip through California would be the adventure of a lifetime. I was wrong. What was supposed to be a peaceful getaway turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. And if I had made one wrong move, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. It started like any other trip. I rented a used RV from a guy in Los Angeles, packed enough supplies for 2 weeks, and hit the road. My plan was to drive up the coast, camp in a few national parks, and disconnect from the stress of daily life. The first few days were perfect. Sunsets over the Pacific, quiet nights under the stars. But things took a turn when I decided to venture into Northern California, near the Shasta Trinity National Forest. I was driving down a long, empty stretch of road when I noticed a pickup truck following me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after an hour, it was still there. Every turn I made, the truck followed. Even when I pulled into a rest area, the driver parked a few spaces away and just sat there. Something felt wrong. I decided to keep driving, thinking I could lose him once I reached a more populated area. But instead of finding more traffic, I found myself on an increasingly narrow road, surrounded by dense forest. My GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and I hadn't seen another car in miles. Then my RV suddenly sputtered and died. I tried the ignition, nothing. The battery was fine. The fuel gauge showed I still had gas, but for some reason, the engine just wouldn't turn over. And that's when I saw the truck pull up behind me. The driver didn't get out at first. He just sat there, watching. Then, slowly, he stepped out. He was tall, middle-aged, wearing a dusty cap and a worn-out flannel shirt. Something about the way he moved, calm, deliberate, sent a chill down my spine. "Need some help?" he called out. Every instinct in me screamed no. I forced a smile and said I was fine, that a tow truck was on the way. He just stood there, staring. Then he took a few steps closer. "No signal out here," he said. "No tow trucks coming." He was right. I had no way to call for help. That's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait and find out what he wanted. I told him I was just going to check something under the hood and stepped out of the RV. As soon as I was on solid ground, I took off running into the woods. I didn't look back. I just ran. Branches scratched my arms, my legs ached, but I kept going. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast. He was chasing me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I saw a dirt road ahead. And then, by some miracle, I heard an engine. A real one. A battered old Jeep was coming down the road. I ran straight into its path, waving my arms like a madman. The driver, an older guy, maybe in his 60s, slammed on the brakes and jumped out. "What the hell?" he asked. I spun around. The man from the truck had stopped at the edge of the woods, just standing there. He didn't follow me onto the road. He just turned around and walked back into the trees. I never saw him again. The older guy in the Jeep drove me to the nearest town. When we went back with the tow truck, my RV was still there, untouched. But when the mechanic looked at the engine, he found something chilling. The fuel line had been cut. Someone had sabotaged my RV, deliberately. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted. But I know one thing. If I hadn't run, if I'd stayed to accept his help, I might not be alive to tell this story. So if you ever take an RV trip through California, stay on main roads. Keep your gas tank full. And if you ever feel like someone's following you, trust your instincts. I've traveled a lot, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened on my solo RV trip through California. I made a mistake that nearly cost me my life, and if you're thinking about taking a similar trip, I need you to hear this. I had been dreaming of a road trip along the West Coast for years. After finally saving enough, I rented an RV from a private owner in San Diego and set off on what I thought would be the adventure of a lifetime. The first week was incredible. I visited Joshua Tree, camped under the stars, and explored Big Sur. But everything changed when I decided to take a detour through a lesser-known part of Northern California, somewhere off Highway 36, near the Trinity Alps wilderness. That's where my nightmare began. I had been driving for hours when I realized I was running low on gas. I pulled into the first station I found, an old rundown place with a single pump. There was no one around except an older man sitting on the porch, chewing tobacco. "You sure you want to keep driving this way?" he asked as I filled my tank. I laughed it off and told him I'd be fine. He just shook his head and muttered something under his breath. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I should have. About an hour later, I noticed a car behind me, a beat-up sedan that I had seen back at the gas station. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but when I stopped to stretch my legs, the car pulled over too. The driver never got out. The sun was setting, and I started feeling uneasy. I got back in the RV and kept going. But no matter how many turns I took, how many back roads I followed, the car stayed behind me. I was officially freaked out. I found a small clearing just off the road, deep enough into the woods that I thought I'd be out of sight. I killed the lights, turned off the engine, and waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. But just as I was about to climb into bed, I heard something outside, soft footsteps. Close. My blood ran cold. I reached for my phone. No service. Then a shadow passed by the front windshield. Someone was out there. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, slowly, the door handle started to jiggle. At that moment, I knew whoever was out there wasn't just some lost hiker. I had one chance. I grabbed the keys, turned the ignition, and slammed my foot on the gas. The RV roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw them. 3 men, dressed in dark clothes, standing just feet away from my vehicle. One of them had a crowbar. I didn't wait to see what they wanted. I tore out of there, speeding down the dirt road like my life depended on it, because it did. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit gas station nearly 40 miles away. When I finally got service and looked at a map, I realized something terrifying. I had parked barely a mile away from an abandoned town. A town with a history of disappearances. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. And I don't want to know. So if you ever take an RV trip in California, remember this. Stay on main roads. Always trust your gut. And if you ever feel like you're being followed, you probably are. I never planned on telling this story. Part of me still hopes that what I saw wasn't real, that maybe I was sleep-deprived, hallucinating, or caught in some weird trick of the mind. But no matter how many ways I try to rationalize it, I keep coming back to one fact. I saw it, and it saw me. It all started when I decided to take an extended RV trip through California, mostly to disconnect from everything. I had been working nonstop for months, and I needed a break. I rented an older RV from a private owner, packed everything I'd need, and planned a route that would take me through some of the state's most beautiful, remote locations. The trip started off great. I drove up the coast, camped in Big Sur, and even spent a few nights near the Redwood National Park. But then, I made a mistake. A small decision that led to something I can never explain. I was in Northern California, somewhere past the Lassen National Forest, when I decided to take an old forest road that wasn't on my GPS. It looked well-maintained, and my map showed a few small lakes in the area. I figured it would be the perfect quiet spot to camp for the night. About 2 hours down the road, the forest got dense. The trees were massive, towering over my RV, and the deeper I went, the darker it got. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, the thick canopy above barely let any sunlight through. That's when I noticed something odd. The forest was silent. No birds, no insects. Just the faint hum of my RV's engine. If you've ever been in deep wilderness, you know there's always something making noise. But here, nothing. It felt wrong. I should have turned back. Instead, I kept driving. I found a small clearing next to a dried-up creek bed and decided to set up camp. I stepped outside, stretched my legs, and took in the air. It was cold. Much colder than it should have been for that time of year, and the silence was still there. No wind, no rustling leaves, just nothing. Trying to shake the unease, I made dinner, locked up the RV, and climbed into bed. Then, around 2 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The RV was pitch black, and everything was still quiet. But then, I felt it. Something was watching me. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Then, I heard it. A faint click, click, click sound coming from outside. It was slow, deliberate, moving around the RV. My first thought was that it was an animal. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I realized the footsteps were too heavy, too precise. I reached for my phone, but of course, there was no signal. My heart was pounding. I had to see what it was. I slid out of bed as quietly as possible and peeked through one of the small windows. And that's when I saw it. It was standing just beyond the tree line, tall, gaunt, a shape I can't fully describe. Its limbs were too long, its joints slightly bent in ways that didn't make sense. The skin, if it even was skin, looked stretched, pale, almost translucent under the moonlight. But the worst part? It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been. I felt paralyzed. Every instinct in me screamed to hide, to stay still, to not let it know I was watching. But then, in the silence of that dead forest, it moved. Not like a person, not like an animal. It was almost like it glided, shifting forward without making a sound. Then it turned its head, or whatever it had for a head, directly toward me. It knew I was there. That's when the clicking sound started again. But this time, it was louder, closer. I don't remember making the decision to move. I just acted. I scrambled to the driver's seat, fumbled for the keys, and turned the ignition. The RV roared to life. Headlights flooded the trees, and the thing was gone. But the clicking wasn't. It was right outside the RV now, moving toward the passenger side door. I slammed my foot on the gas. The RV lurched forward, bouncing over the rough dirt path as I sped back the way I came. I didn't care about wrecking the vehicle. I just needed to get out. I don't know how long I drove, but eventually I saw something that made me nearly cry from relief. Streetlights. A real road, civilization. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station hours away. I parked under the bright lights, locked the doors, and sat there shaking. The next day, I tried to find the road I had taken. I looked at maps, even drove back to the general area, but it wasn't there. The road didn't exist. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was something ancient, something not meant to be seen, or if I had somehow stepped into a place I wasn't supposed to be. But I do know this. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road in the deep forests of California, and you hear that clicking sound, doctor, not stop. I'm Kyle, a 32-year-old travel blogger. I've been on countless road trips, documenting everything from coastal towns to hidden gems in national parks. But I'll never forget the RV trip I took through California, where what I encountered wasn't just strange. It was downright dangerous. I had just finished a successful summer of blogging, and I wanted to get away from the usual tourist spots for a while. So, I rented an old RV and planned a solo trip through Northern California, hoping to explore some of the more remote and untouched areas. The idea was to disconnect, camp off-grid, and immerse myself in nature. The first few days were incredible. I spent some time along the coast near Mendocino and everything felt perfect. But as I ventured deeper inland, toward the Shasta Trinity National Forest, things started to feel off. It started subtly at first. I was driving on a narrow, winding road when I noticed that my GPS was acting strangely. It kept flickering, and the route seemed to be rerouting itself, though there was no signal loss. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a glitch or something. But it was only the beginning. After a few more miles, I decided to stop and stretch my legs at a pull-off area. The forest was dense, and the only sounds were my footsteps crunching the dry leaves and the occasional rustling from a nearby animal. I was a little unnerved by the silence, but I chalked it up to being deep in the woods. Still, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I continued down the road, I noticed something else. The trees seemed to be leaning toward me. I know it sounds strange, but the way the branches curved in a way that made them almost reach out to the RV was unsettling. They looked like twisted long arms, stretching toward the vehicle. I tried not to think about it. After all, I was out in the wilderness. Weird things happen. But then I saw it. Something that made my heart drop. A set of tire tracks in the dirt, but they weren't just any tracks. They were fresh, as though someone had driven by only moments ago, and they led off the main road into the woods. I had been driving for hours without seeing another soul, so the thought that someone was nearby was unsettling. But what truly made my skin crawl was that there were no other vehicles in sight, no other tracks leading back to the main road. I decided to pull off and investigate. As I walked along the tracks, I felt like I was being watched. That feeling you get when you know someone, or something, is behind you, even though you can't see them. And then I heard it. A faint buzzing noise, like a swarm of flies coming from the direction of the tracks. I thought I had imagined it, but the sound grew louder, closer. It was almost like a hum. I looked up just in time to see something move at the edge of the trees. Something big. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It was some kind of machine. I can't even explain what it was, but it was massive. It looked like some kind of industrial vehicle, except it had no wheels. It hovered a few inches off the ground, the underside of it glowing faintly with an eerie green light. There were no markings, no recognizable features, just a large, dark shape that moved unnaturally through the forest, its low hum shaking the ground beneath me. Panic set in. I bolted back to my RV, but I didn't get far before I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A voice. It was distorted, static-filled, like it was coming through a broken radio, but I could make out one word. Leave. My heart pounded as I ran back to the RV, jumped in, and locked the doors. The sound of the hum was growing louder. My engine sputtered to life, but before I could drive away, the vehicle jerked violently to the side, as if something had grabbed hold of it. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and the RV surged forward, but the hum followed me. I didn't stop driving until I reached a highway. Even then, I could feel my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me, but nothing was there. The next day, I called the local authorities to report what happened. I wasn't expecting them to take me seriously, and they didn't. They told me it was probably just a large animal or a malfunctioning piece of machinery from a nearby logging operation. But I know what I saw, and I'm telling you, it wasn't anything like that. I never went back to that part of California. I'm Mark, a 38-year-old photographer who has spent years traveling through different parts of the country for work. I've always preferred remote areas and hidden spots to capture unique landscapes for my portfolio. So when I got the chance to rent an RV and explore California's backcountry, I jumped at the opportunity. Little did I know that I was about to have an encounter I couldn't explain, one that would change everything about how I view the wilderness. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was to get out of the city, drive up the coast, and then cut inland toward the Sequoia National Forest. I'd always been fascinated by the massive trees in remote areas that most people never think to visit. I wanted to photograph untouched nature and stay away from the crowded tourist spots. The RV rental was the perfect way to be mobile and self-sufficient in places that didn't have any accommodations. The first few days were incredible. I spent time in Big Sur and along the Pacific Coast Highway. Everything felt exactly how I imagined it. Quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated. But everything changed when I ventured toward the eastern part of the Sierra Nevada, close to a place called Inyo National Forest. That's where things took a turn for the bizarre. One evening, as the sun was beginning to set, I was driving down a narrow, winding road well off the main highways. I had been following a route I'd found online, hoping to get to a remote lake where I could camp for the night. As I rounded a corner, I saw a sign for a small pull-out area. It seemed like a good place to park for a while and take in the view, so I pulled over and killed the engine. That's when I first noticed something strange. At first, it was subtle, just a feeling, a shift in the atmosphere around me. The air grew unnaturally still, and the distant sounds of wildlife seemed to vanish. I assumed it was just the isolation, but then I saw something through the trees. Movement, a figure darting between the trunks. It was quick, too fast for an animal, and it seemed to be watching me. I grabbed my camera, thinking it might be a deer or some other large animal, but when I focused the lens, I didn't see anything that matched what I was expecting. What I saw instead made my stomach drop. The figure I had glimpsed was too tall. It was thin, unnaturally so, with limbs that looked like they were stretched beyond normal proportions. The way it moved was wrong. It didn't walk like a person, nor did it appear to be any animal I had ever seen. It glided, almost floating, as it moved between the trees, blending into the shadows. I was stunned. I couldn't move or react for a few seconds. But then, I quickly realized I had to get out of there. I didn't know what that thing was, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I jumped into the RV, locked the doors, and started the engine. That's when the real nightmare began. As soon as the engine roared to life, I saw something that made my heart race even faster. From the rearview mirror, I saw the figure again, now standing on the road behind me. It was too close, too fast. It was no longer hiding in the trees. It was right in the open, watching me. Move I panicked. My hands were shaking as I tried to back out of the parking area. The figure didn't. It just stood there, motionless. But its presence felt overwhelming. It was waiting. I backed the RV up as quickly as I could, my tires screeching as I turned the wheel sharply to avoid hitting it. For a moment, I thought I'd hit it, but the figure just stepped aside. It didn't make a sound. I floored the gas pedal and the RV shot forward. I didn't care about the road anymore. I just needed to get away. I drove for what felt like hours, constantly looking in the mirrors to see if it was following me, but it never appeared. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest small town, and I was so shaken that I couldn't even bring myself to look at the maps or GPS to figure out where I was. I stayed in a local motel that night, completely on edge. Even though I was surrounded by people, I kept feeling like someone, or something, was watching me. The next morning, I drove back to the spot where I had pulled over, hoping to get some answers. But when I arrived, there was nothing. No sign of the figure, no trace of any strange movement. It was as if the entire area had returned to normal, as though nothing had ever happened. I checked my camera to see if I had managed to take a picture, but the photo I'd taken was blurry and out of focus, just a dark smudge where I thought the figure had been. I left that area quickly and I never went back. The rest of my trip through California was uneventful, but the experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw that day wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. I couldn't explain it, but I've never been the same since. It's a reminder that even the most beautiful places in the world can hide things that we're not meant to see. My name is Sarah, and I've always been a lover of the outdoors. I've done my fair share of solo trips and have spent countless nights camping in the wilds of California. But what happened on one trip a couple of months ago was unlike anything I could have ever prepared for. I'll never forget the horrors I witnessed in the remote hills of California, and I warn anyone thinking of going alone in the wilderness. Don't do it. I was in my late 20s when I decided to take a week-long solo RV trip through the northern part of California. I had recently taken some time off work, and I wanted a peaceful escape to clear my mind. I rented a small RV, stocked up on supplies, and set out toward the Redwood National Park. The idea was to drive through some of the more isolated areas, visit a few quiet campsites, and take photos of the majestic landscapes. At first, it was everything I wanted. The towering trees, the endless views of the ocean, and the absolute silence that comes with being completely disconnected from civilization. It was pure bliss. I drove along winding roads through thick forests, stopping at scenic spots to take pictures and breathe in the fresh air. The first few days were peaceful, almost idyllic, but then things started to change. I had been driving on a secluded road for hours, far from any town or human presence, when I noticed something strange. The sky, which had been mostly clear, suddenly became overcast. There was no weather forecast predicting any change, so it didn't make sense. But the weather wasn't what caught my attention. It was what I saw on the side of the road. There, at the edge of the woods, stood an old rusted vehicle. It looked like it had been there for years, covered in dirt, moss, and overgrowth. The strange part wasn't just the vehicle itself, but how out of place it seemed. The car wasn't a typical abandoned vehicle. It didn't have a license plate, and it wasn't the usual type of car you would find in these areas. It looked like a Jeep, but the body was far too old, and the tires had long since deflated. I slowed the RV as I passed by, wondering if there was someone around who had gotten stuck or needed help. But as I glanced out of the window, I didn't see anyone. Just trees, rocks, and an eerie stillness that seemed to engulf everything around me. I continued down the road for another hour, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, but I couldn't. Eventually, I found a small pull-out area to stop and take a break. I decided to stretch my legs and have some water. As I stepped out of the RV, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something wrong, something in the air. That's when I heard the sound. It was a low, guttural hum, like a vibration deep in the earth. It wasn't a car engine, and it wasn't an animal. It sounded almost mechanical. At first, I thought it might be coming from the nearby forest, but then I realized that it was coming from the direction of the old vehicle I had seen earlier. Curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my flashlight and walked back toward where I had seen the rusted Jeep. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But as I approached the spot, my heart started to race. The vehicle was no longer there. There was no sign of it, no tracks in the dirt, nothing. It was as if it had disappeared completely. But the humming sound persisted, louder now, as though something underground was vibrating. I froze. Something wasn't right. I turned around and quickly headed back to the RV. But as I was walking, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Across the dirt road from the pull-out area, there was a figure standing in the woods, just barely visible between the trees. It was tall, too tall, and it seemed to be watching me. It was humanoid, but something about the way it stood, so rigid and unnaturally still, made me feel like I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. I rushed back to the RV, locked the doors, and started the engine without hesitation. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure still watching me. But there was nothing. I kept driving, too scared to stop anywhere for the night. Hours passed, and I finally reached a small town. I stayed in a motel that night, my mind racing with questions and doubts. I kept thinking about the figure I had seen. Had it been real? Had I just imagined it? And what was that humming sound? The next day, I decided to visit the local ranger station to ask about the area and see if anyone else had reported strange occurrences. The ranger I spoke to looked at me oddly when I asked about the vehicle and the figure in the woods. "It's not uncommon for people to get lost in those hills," he said. "A lot of folks come here looking for peace, but not all of them find it." I left, still unsure about what had happened, but convinced that I had encountered something that couldn't be explained. I've been back to California a few times since, but I've never ventured back to those hills. Whatever it was I saw, whatever I heard, I'll never forget it. My name is James, and I'm a 45-year-old avid camper and off-roader. I've spent a good chunk of my life exploring the California desert in my 4x4, looking for hidden gems and remote camping spots far away from civilization. I've been to some pretty desolate places, but nothing could prepare me for what happened on one particular trip. I've been hesitant to share this story because I can't explain what happened, but after months of thinking it over, I've come to realize that it's something I need to talk about. It all started last fall. I had been planning a solo camping trip in the Mojave Desert for weeks. I've camped in this area before, but I had recently heard about a remote spot, not far from the Joshua Tree National Park, where few people go. I decided it would be the perfect getaway, a chance to get off the grid, disconnect, and just enjoy the solitude of the desert. I packed up my gear, fueled up the truck, and headed out early in the morning. The drive was long, and the desert stretched out for miles with no sign of civilization. I passed a few other vehicles along the way, but soon I was on an isolated stretch of road, deep in the heart of the Mojave, where cell service was non-existent, and the only sound was the hum of my truck's engine. Around mid-afternoon, I reached my destination. A dry, rocky valley surrounded by towering desert hills. There were no other cars around, no signs of life. It felt completely isolated, and that's exactly what I wanted. I set up camp, made some coffee, and took in the vast desert landscape, which felt almost unreal in its quietness. But that peace didn't last long. As the sun began to set, I noticed something strange. There was a low, distant hum that seemed to come from the hills behind me. At first, I thought it might be a plane flying overhead, but I quickly realized that it wasn't a plane. It was too low, too constant, and it didn't seem to move. The sound didn't change, and it didn't seem to come from any specific direction. Curious and a bit uneasy, I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the sound. As I got closer to the hills, the humming grew louder, but it still didn't have a clear source. It felt as if the ground itself was vibrating. My skin started to tingle with unease. There was no breeze, no other sounds of wildlife, just that constant, eerie hum. I continued walking for a while, but the closer I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. It wasn't just the sound, it was the atmosphere. The desert, which had felt so calm and peaceful earlier, now felt oppressive, as if the air itself was thick with something I couldn't explain. After about an hour of walking, I came to a small clearing at the base of one of the hills, and that's when I saw it. There was a large metallic object partially buried in the sand. It was roughly the size of a minivan, and it was sleek, silver, and completely unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It didn't look like a piece of modern technology, nor did it resemble any kind of machinery I recognized. The shape was unusual, almost rounded, with strange markings along its surface. I couldn't make out the details, but they seemed to shimmer in the dim light as if they were shifting. The humming noise was coming from the object. I could feel the vibration in my chest, as if the entire desert had come alive. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. I had heard stories of UFO sightings in the Mojave, but this didn't look like anything that could be explained away by conventional means. I stood there for several minutes, watching, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The object, if it was ever there, seemed to vanish. The vibrations in the ground ceased, and the desert returned to its eerie silence. I didn't know what to think. I walked around the area, but I couldn't find any trace of the object I had seen. No markings in the sand, no disturbance at all, just a perfectly calm desert floor. It was as though the whole thing had been a mirage, a hallucination. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something that shouldn't have been there. I quickly left the area, not wanting to stay another minute. I packed up my camp and drove back the way I came, my mind racing with a million questions I couldn't answer. I didn't tell anyone about what I had seen, and I haven't been back to that area since. It's been months, but I still can't explain it. I've done a lot of camping and exploring over the years, but that experience was unlike anything I've ever encountered. Whether it was a natural phenomenon, an experimental piece of technology, or something far more mysterious, I'll never know. But I'm sure of one thing: whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the Mojave Desert. My name is Mark, and I'm an experienced hiker. I've spent years exploring the rugged terrains of California, from the Sierra Nevada to the coastal mountains, and I've never gotten lost before. I know the trails, the weather patterns, and the signs of nature. But there's one trip I'll never forget, one that taught me more about survival than any guidebook could ever do. It was the beginning of summer when I decided to take a solo hiking trip into the San Bernardino Mountains. I had been wanting to explore a trail called the San Bernardino Peak Trail, which was known for its stunning views of the desert below and the lush forests at higher elevations. I had done research and mapped out the trail, knowing it was going to be a long day hike, but nothing that should have caused concern. The weather forecast was clear, and I was feeling confident. I started my hike at around 7 a.m., just as the sun was rising. The air was crisp, and the mountain was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I quickly got into a rhythm, enjoying the peaceful solitude. I passed a few fellow hikers, but for the most part, I was alone, and I preferred it that way. The trail was steep at first, climbing up from the base of the mountain through thick pine forests. As I ascended, the views opened up, and I could see the vastness of the desert below, stretching all the way to the horizon. I stopped for a few photos, took a sip of water, and continued on. Everything seemed perfect. But as the day wore on, I started to realize that something was off. The trail had become less clear. At first, I assumed it was just the normal wear and tear of hiking, but then it became harder to follow. The path wasn't marked as well as it should have been, and I found myself wandering off course. I checked my map and compass and thought I could still figure it out. I had done this enough times to know how to navigate, so I didn't panic. However, the more I walked, the less certain I became. The sun was high in the sky now, and I hadn't seen another hiker in hours. The forest was thick, and there were no clear markers to tell me which way to go. The only sound was the wind through the trees. After what felt like an eternity, I realized I had lost the trail entirely. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. I tried retracing my steps, but the landscape was eerily unfamiliar. My heart started to pound in my chest as I realized that I was lost. I knew enough to stay calm and not let panic take over, but it wasn't easy. I knew I had to stay put and wait for help, but there was no one around. No one would come looking for me until nightfall, and by then, it would be too late. I had no cell service, and I was miles away from any marked trail. I decided to try and find my way back, but after hours of wandering, I was no closer to finding the path. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, and I realized I would have to spend the night in the wilderness. I found a small clearing near a stream and decided to set up camp. I had enough gear for an overnight stay, my tent, sleeping bag, food, and water, but I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. I had been in the wilderness many times, but never this deep into the mountains, and never this far off course. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. I was cold and uncomfortable in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the bushes made me wonder what was out there. I've always prided myself on being able to handle myself in the wilderness, but this felt different. Something didn't sit right. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. The next morning, I woke up to find frost on the ground. I had been shivering throughout the night, but the sun was up now, and I knew I needed to make a plan. I had two options. I could keep wandering and risk getting even further off course, or I could stay put and wait for rescue. I chose the latter, hoping that someone would notice I hadn't returned. I spent the day sitting by the stream, conserving my energy and keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of other hikers. But the whole day passed with no sign of life. As dusk fell once again, I began to fear the worst. I was isolated, running low on food, and my water supply was shrinking. My cell phone had no signal, and I was beginning to feel the full weight of my situation. The third day came, and by now I was nearly out of food and water. I had been eating only granola bars and drinking from the stream. My body was starting to feel the effects of dehydration, and my head was spinning. I knew I couldn't stay in the same spot much longer. I decided to try one last time to make it back to civilization. I gathered my things, packed up my tent, and started walking. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me to a road or a trail. But after hours of walking, it seemed like the wilderness was swallowing me whole. The trees were closing in, the terrain was getting steeper, and my sense of direction was completely shot. By the afternoon of the fourth day, I was exhausted, hungry, and completely disoriented. I stumbled across a small campsite. Nothing fancy, just a few old tents and a fire ring. It was abandoned, but the sight of it gave me hope. I was so relieved to find a sign of human life that I almost cried. I searched through the area, but there was nothing to suggest who had been there or when they had left. However, I took it as a sign that I wasn't alone, and I needed to press on. Finally, just as I was about to give up hope, I heard a distant sound, a car engine. I couldn't believe it. I followed the sound as best I could, and after an agonizing hour of hiking, I stumbled upon a trailhead. It was a well-maintained trail, one I recognized from my map. It was just a few miles away from the nearest road, and by nightfall, I was finally able to hitch a ride to safety. The whole experience shook me to my core. I had never felt so helpless in the wilderness. I've been back to the San Bernardino Mountains since that trip, but I'll never forget what it felt like to be lost, without a clear direction, without help, and without hope. I've learned to respect the wilderness in a way I never did before. My name is Sarah, and my boyfriend Tom and I decided to take a road trip through Northern California one summer. We had been together for about 2 years, and after weeks of stressful work, we were both in need of a getaway. We had no specific destination in mind, just a desire to escape our daily routines and take a scenic drive through the Golden State. We packed up our car with everything we'd need: snacks, a cooler, some camping gear, and of course, our favorite playlists for the road. Our plan was to drive up the coast, take in the beautiful views, and stop at a few quirky small towns along the way. We both love exploring new places, and this seemed like the perfect trip to disconnect and reconnect with each other. We started off early on a Friday morning, leaving our apartment in Los Angeles and hitting the 101 north. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, and we made good time. We stopped for coffee and pastries at a roadside cafe in Santa Barbara and continued up toward San Luis Obispo. The views were amazing, with the ocean on one side and the hills on the other. We had no specific plans, just a sense of freedom. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, we decided to take a detour and drive through the winding mountain roads of Big Sur. It was one of those spur-of-the-moment decisions that felt right, and we were excited to experience the less traveled part of California. We didn't realize, though, that the further we went into the mountains, the more isolated the roads became. Around dusk, we found ourselves on a narrow, unpaved road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dense forest. The GPS showed no signs of cell service, but we didn't think much of it at the time. After all, we were just a couple of adventurous souls enjoying the open road. The sounds of crickets and rustling leaves filled the air, and the further we drove, the more we felt disconnected from everything, like we were in another world. After driving for about an hour, we came across a small, rustic cabin on the side of the road. It was hard to see at first, but the flickering light in the window caught our attention. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance, but there was something about it that piqued our curiosity. We had been driving for a while and decided to stretch our legs, so we pulled over, got out, and walked up to the cabin. The moment we stepped onto the porch, we felt an odd sense of stillness. It was quiet. Too quiet. There was no sign of anyone around, but there was something unsettling about the place. Tom knocked on the door, and after a few seconds the door creaked open just slightly, but no one was there. We hesitated, not sure if we should go inside. Tom wanted to leave, but I was curious, so I took a few steps forward and peeked inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, but there was one thing that caught my eye, a photo on the mantel. It was a picture of a couple, smiling and holding hands, with a young child in the middle. There was nothing remarkable about the photo, but it made me feel uneasy. Something about it felt too personal, too out of place for a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Tom and I stood there for a moment, just looking at the photo. The silence seemed to stretch on forever. Then, without warning, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep in the forest. We both jumped, and the moment was broken. The sense of calm that had been there before was replaced by a feeling of urgency. We quickly left the cabin and got back into the car, not saying much to each other. The drive back down the mountain felt much longer than the drive up. It was dark now, and we couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As we drove back, we started talking about what had happened. Tom was still a bit shaken, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin and the picture. Why had it felt so eerie? And why had the door opened without anyone being there? We couldn't make sense of it, but we agreed that we'd avoid the area on future trips. The rest of the trip was pretty uneventful. We made it to San Francisco the next day and had a relaxing weekend, but we kept talking about the strange experience in Big Sur. Even now, a few years later, we still bring it up from time to time. Was it just an abandoned cabin, or was there something more to it? We'll never know for sure, but it's a memory that stuck with us. A reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments can leave the biggest impressions. My name is Emily, and I want to share a story that my family will never forget. It was the summer of 2019 when we decided to take a weekend road trip up the coast of Northern California. My husband John and I were eager to get away from the usual routine of work and school for our two kids, Mia and Ben. We had heard so many great things about the Redwood National Park and its towering trees, so we thought it would be the perfect family getaway. We set out early on a Friday morning, packed the car with snacks, camping gear, and a portable cooler full of drinks. We had planned a relaxing few days in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Our plan was simple: camp near the redwoods, take some hikes, and just enjoy the serenity of the park. We all had high hopes for this trip. The drive was beautiful, with the winding roads of the coastal highway offering breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean on one side and the forested hills on the other. We made a few stops along the way to stretch our legs and snap photos. Mia and Ben were excited, and I could tell John was looking forward to getting away from his work emails and phone calls. Everything was going as planned. We reached the park by early afternoon and found a quiet, secluded campground that was just off one of the main hiking trails. It was tucked away in a grove of towering redwoods, and the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. We set up our tent, started a small campfire, and made dinner together. The kids were fascinated by the size of the trees and spent time exploring the area while John and I prepared food. It was a perfect evening, a peaceful escape from our busy lives. As night fell, the forest seemed to come alive with the sounds of creatures we couldn't see: chirping crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional hoot of an owl. We all sat around the campfire, enjoying each other's company and the simple pleasure of being together. Mia and Ben were excited to tell us stories, and we spent hours talking, laughing, and making s'mores. It felt like the kind of night you dream about on a family vacation. But as the evening wore on, something strange started to happen. The forest grew eerily quiet. At first, We thought it was just the usual sounds of nightfall, but as the minutes passed, it became more pronounced. The rustling in the trees stopped, and the crickets fell silent. It was as if the whole forest had held its breath. Even the wind had stopped. I thought maybe it was just the weather or something that happens in the woods at night, so I tried to shake it off. Suddenly, we heard a sound. A loud crack, like something heavy had broken in the distance. It wasn't an animal. It was far too loud and deliberate. John and I exchanged nervous glances, but we didn't want to worry the kids, so we continued talking. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a distant voice. It was faint but unmistakable, a low, soft murmuring sound, like someone was talking just beyond our campsite. We froze. The voice wasn't clear, but it was definitely there. Mia and Ben were immediately curious, asking, "Who's talking, Mom?" I tried to reassure them, telling them it was probably someone else camping in the distance. But I could tell from John's expression that he didn't believe that. He stood up, his face pale, and walked to the edge of the campsite, peering into the darkness. "Stay here," he said, his voice low but tense. I stayed with the kids while John ventured a little further. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before he came back. He was visibly shaken, his face drawn and pale. "There's no one out there," he said quietly, his voice unsteady. "There's no one for miles. I think it's just the wind, maybe, or an animal. But it didn't sound like anything I've ever heard before." We sat in silence for a while, unsure what to do. The weird noise stopped, but the silence that followed was almost worse. We packed up what we could quickly and made the decision to leave. We didn't want to scare the kids, but it didn't feel safe to stay any longer. John and I kept exchanging uneasy glances, both feeling the same creeping sense of unease that we couldn't shake. We began packing up our tent and gear, trying to move quietly so the kids wouldn't sense our panic. But when we were almost done, we noticed something strange. Footprints. Fresh, large footprints appeared in the dirt around our campsite, as if someone or something had been walking around us in the dark. They weren't animal tracks. They were human-like, but not exactly right. They were too large, too deep for someone just passing through. I don't know if they were just a trick of the mind, but they made us even more nervous. As we packed everything into the car, we kept looking over our shoulders. We didn't speak much on the way out, but I could tell John was on high alert. The kids, still unaware of the gravity of the situation, fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the day's activities. It wasn't until we were a few miles down the road that we finally spoke about it. "We're leaving," John said firmly. "We're not going back there again, not tonight." And that was that. We drove to the nearest town and booked a room in a small inn for the night. The next morning, we drove out of the area and decided to cut the trip short. The whole experience was surreal, and we never went back to that campground. To this day, we don't know what happened that night. We never found out who or what was making those noises, or what caused the footprints. All we know is that it didn't feel right, and we weren't willing to take any more chances. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was something else entirely. But we learned one thing for sure: not every adventure is meant to be a peaceful one. I'm writing this because I don't want anyone else to make the same mistake I did. I thought an RV trip through California would be the perfect getaway. Freedom, nature, and no stress. But what was supposed to be an amazing adventure turned into a nightmare I barely escaped from. If you're considering doing the same, don't. It all started normally. I had planned a 2-week trip, driving up the coast and then cutting inland to explore the mountains and deserts. By the 3rd day, I started noticing strange things. My gas gauge was dropping faster than it should have. I figured maybe I had miscalculated, but when I checked for leaks, everything seemed fine. It was weird, but not enough to make me panic. Then, one night while I was parked at a rest stop near Monterey, I heard footsteps outside my RV. Slow, deliberate steps, circling. I turned off my lights and stayed quiet. After about 10 minutes, they stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe another traveler stretching their legs. But deep down, something felt off. A few days later, I drove into the Sierra Nevada mountains and found a remote campsite. No people, no noise, just what I wanted. That night, I woke up to the sound of my RV door handle jiggling. I knew I had locked it. I grabbed my flashlight and listened. A minute later, there was a soft knock. I didn't answer. Then my RV shook. Someone was pushing against it. I started the engine and floored it, driving non-stop until I found a gas station near a highway. I didn't see anyone following me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Still, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a random hiker. Maybe it was nothing. But my biggest mistake was not going home immediately. A few days later, I was in the Mojave Desert, driving through an empty stretch of road when my check engine light came on. I pulled over and popped the hood. That's when I saw it. Someone had cut my fuel line, not worn out, not an accident, cut deliberately. I felt my stomach drop. Then, in the distance, I saw a figure, a man, standing perfectly still, watching me. He wasn't lost, he wasn't hiking, he was waiting. I didn't think. I just grabbed the emergency fuel canister, patched up the line as best as I could, and got back on the road. I drove for hours without stopping. When I finally made it to a mechanic, he confirmed what I already knew. Someone had tried to leave me stranded, and they had done it in a way that ensured I wouldn't notice until it was too late. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. But I know this. If I had stayed another night, if I had hesitated for even a few more minutes, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. So if you're thinking about taking an RV trip through California, don't. I never thought I'd be the guy telling a horror story, but here I am. My name is Kyle Henderson, and what I'm about to share is something I still can't fully explain. It happened last summer. I had just bought a used RV, nothing fancy, but good enough for road trips. My plan was simple. Take a solo trip up the California coast, clear my head, and just enjoy the open road. Things were great at first. I started in San Diego, made my way through Big Sur, and eventually decided to cut inland toward the Sierra Nevadas. That's when everything went wrong. I was somewhere near the Sequoia National Forest, driving at dusk, when I saw a sign for a remote campground. It wasn't on my map, but I figured why not. I pulled in and found only one other RV parked there, an older Winnebago with no lights on. The whole place was eerily quiet, but I was exhausted. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound, like something brushing against the side of my RV. I froze. Then came a soft tapping on my window. Just 3 knocks. I peeked through the curtain, but saw nothing. I told myself it was just the wind or a tree branch and forced myself back to sleep. But the next morning, when I stepped outside, I saw something chilling. Handprints. Small, dirt-covered handprints all over the side of my RV. I looked around, but the other RV was gone. No tire tracks, no signs it had ever been there. I didn't waste time. I packed up and left immediately. But as I was driving down the winding road back to the highway, my GPS went haywire. It kept rerouting me, taking me deeper into the forest. I swear, it felt like I was driving in circles. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in my headlights. A man, standing in the middle of the road. He was wearing tattered clothes, his face obscured by shadows. I slammed the brakes, my heart pounding. But when I blinked, he was gone. I floored it. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out. After what felt like an eternity, I finally found the highway. The second I hit civilization, my GPS started working normally again, like nothing had happened. To this day, I have no idea what I experienced. I checked later, and there was no record of a campground at that location. Locals told me stories of an old site that was shut down decades ago after a series of disappearances. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But if you ever find yourself on a lonely road in California and you see a campground that's not on your map, keep driving. You don't want to make my mistake. My name is Daniel Carter, and I need to get this off my chest. If you're planning an RV trip through California, think twice, because I made a mistake that nearly cost me my life. It happened last fall. I had just bought a used RV, planning a solo road trip across the state. I wanted to see the hidden gems of California, the places tourists don't go. That's how I ended up on an old highway cutting through the northern forests, somewhere between Redding and the Oregon border. I had been driving all day and needed a place to park for the night. That's when I saw a small wooden sign, Evergreen Campground, 2 miles ahead. My GPS didn't show anything, but it looked legit, so I turned onto the dirt road. The place was completely empty. A few old RV hookups, a fire pit, and a tiny office cabin with nobody inside. The sun was setting, and I was too tired to care, so I parked near the tree line and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise, like whispering. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't animals. It was human. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The whispers grew louder, circling the RV. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and peeked through the window. No one was there. But then, I noticed something chilling. Every single window was fogged up. Someone, or something, had been breathing on the glass. I locked every door, shut the curtains, and sat in the driver's seat, gripping my keys. That's when the knocking started. 3 slow knocks on the side of the RV, then another, moving around, as if someone was testing every door. I'd had enough. I fired up the engine and gunned it out of there, barely following the dark dirt road back to the highway. When I finally reached a gas station an hour later, I was shaking. I asked the clerk about Evergreen Campground. He gave me a confused look. That place burned down 30 years ago. I didn't believe him at first, but when I checked online later, I found an old article. Fire destroys Evergreen Campground. 5 campers missing, presumed dead. I don't know who or what was outside my RV that night, but I know this. If you ever see an unmarked campground in the California woods, don't stop. Keep driving, because some places don't want visitors. And if you stay too long, you might never leave. My name is Mark Reynolds, and if you're thinking of taking an RV trip through California, let me stop you right there. I made a mistake that nearly cost me my life, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. This happened 2 years ago when I decided to take my RV and drive along the California coast. I had just retired and wanted to experience the freedom of the open road. I planned to visit small towns, national parks, and some hidden gems along the way. But one wrong turn changed everything. It was late in the afternoon, and I had been driving all day. I was somewhere in Northern California, near the edge of the Redwood National Park, when I saw a sign for a scenic route that wasn't on my original map. I thought, why not? It was supposed to be a shortcut to the next town, and the road looked well paved. But as I continued driving, things started to feel off. The road became narrower, the trees grew taller and denser, blocking out the sunlight. My radio lost signal and my GPS stopped working. I should have turned back, but I figured I'd already come too far. Then I saw it. A small wooden sign barely hanging on its post. Blackwood Campground, 5 miles ahead. It wasn't on my map, but I had been driving for hours and needed to rest. So I made the worst decision of my life. I pulled into the campground just as the sun was setting. It was eerily empty. No other RVs, no tents, not even a ranger station. Just a few abandoned fire pits and a decaying restroom building. I parked near the tree line, locked my doors, and told myself I'd leave at first light. Then, at around midnight, I woke up. Something was moving outside my RV. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, human. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled my RV, crunching softly against the gravel. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my phone. No service, then a tap. Right against my window. I jumped, barely managing to stay quiet. I didn't dare look. I just sat there, frozen, as the tapping moved from one window to another, circling me. Then the whispers started. They were faint just outside the RV. It wasn't just one voice, it was several. Low, distorted murmurs, like a conversation happening just beyond my understanding. I've never felt fear like that before. Then, for the first time, I looked outside. Through the fogged-up window, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, tall, motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out a face, just a dark silhouette. Then, suddenly, it moved. Not like a person, not like an animal, but in a way that sent a deep, primal fear through my body. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my keys, turned the ignition, and floored it. As I sped out of the campground, my headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. More figures, standing between the trees, watching. I don't remember how I got back to the main road. I just drove until I reached a gas station an hour later. The clerk must have seen the terror on my face because he asked if I was okay. I told him what happened, and his face went pale. He said Blackwood Campground burned down in the 70s. A group of campers went missing. They never found them. I didn't sleep that night, and I've never set foot in an RV since. If you ever find yourself on an empty road in California and see a sign for a campground you've never heard of, keep driving. Some places aren't meant to be visited, because some visitors never leave. I've spent my life exploring the open road. My name is Jake Thompson, and for the past 10 years, I've been traveling across the country in my RV, documenting my adventures on my blog. I've driven through deserts, mountains, and back roads most people wouldn't dare set foot on. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened in California last fall. I had been making my way through the Pacific Coast Highway, taking in the breathtaking views. The plan was to cut east through the Sierra Nevada and find a quiet camping spot for the night. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. My GPS lost signal, and my phone was useless. Just as I was about to turn around, I saw a faded wooden sign by the roadside. Whispering Pines Campground, 4 miles ahead. I hadn't heard of it before, but I was exhausted from driving all day. A quiet, hidden campground sounded perfect. So, I took the road. The deeper I drove, the more unsettling it became. The road narrowed, winding through dense pine trees. The air felt heavier, thick with a strange stillness. By the time I reached the campground, the sky was pitch black, and a thick fog had started rolling in. The place was completely deserted. No other RVs, no tents, no signs of recent visitors. The picnic tables were overturned, and the fire pits were filled with old, wet ashes. The wooden sign at the entrance was rotting, barely hanging onto its post, but I was too tired to care. I parked my RV, locked the doors, and told myself I'd leave at first light. At around 3 a.m., something woke me up. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. A low knocking on the side of my RV. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. I wasn't parked near any buildings, and there was no reason anyone should be out here. Then came another sound. Footsteps. Soft but deliberate, circling my RV. I reached for my flashlight, hesitated, then forced myself to peek through the window. The fog outside was thicker now, making it nearly impossible to see beyond a few feet. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something, or rather, someone, standing just at the edge of the fog. A tall, thin figure, motionless, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but before I could move, the knocking started again. This time, it came from the door. I grabbed my keys with shaking hands and turned on the engine. My headlights flickered to life, cutting through the fog, and that's when I saw them. More figures, not just one, but at least half a dozen standing between the trees. Their heads tilted slightly as if observing me. None of them moved, none of them spoke, but I could feel their eyes locked onto me. I slammed the gas pedal and tore out of the campground, gravel flying as I sped back toward the main road. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly 50 miles away. The clerk saw my pale face and asked if I was okay. I muttered something about a weird campground, and his expression darkened. "Whispering Pines?" he asked. I nodded. He shook his head. That place burned down in the 80s. A group of campers vanished without a trace. They never found them. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I just paid for my gas and got back in my RV. I've driven through nearly every state in the U.S., but I have never felt the kind of fear I felt that night. And I will never take an unknown road in California again. If you ever see a sign for a campground you don't recognize, don't stop. Don't be curious. Just keep driving. Some places are lost for a reason. I've been on the road for years, traveling from state to state, never staying in one place for too long. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and back in 2019, I was living in my RV full-time, documenting my travels for a small but dedicated YouTube audience. I loved the freedom, the adventure, the feeling of waking up in a new place every day. But after what happened on Highway 395 in California, I don't think I'll ever go back. I had spent the day driving through the Eastern Sierra, enjoying the quiet roads and beautiful landscapes. The plan was to camp near a small town just past Bridgeport, but as the sun dipped below the mountains, I realized I had miscalculated my timing. My gas was running low, and there were no stations for miles. That's when I saw it. A small dirt road branched off to the right, leading to an old wooden sign that read, "Ridgeview Campground, 2 miles ahead." I hadn't seen it on any maps, but that wasn't unusual. There are plenty of small, unmarked campgrounds scattered across California. Figuring it was better than running out of gas in the middle of nowhere, I turned onto the dirt road. The moment my tires hit the gravel, something felt off. The road was in terrible condition, full of deep potholes and cracks, like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The trees lining the road were dead, blackened and twisted as if they had been struck by fire long ago. But the strangest part, there were no signs of life, no birds, no crickets, nothing. Just silence. By the time I reached the campground, the last bit of daylight was gone. My headlights swept over the area, revealing a handful of empty fire pits and wooden picnic tables covered in moss. There was no sign of recent visitors. No tire tracks, no footprints, nothing. But what really unsettled me was the RV parked near the edge of the site. It was old, rusted, windows shattered. The tires were deflated, and the entire vehicle was covered in dirt and leaves. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. I should have left. Every instinct told me to leave. But I was exhausted, running on empty, and I convinced myself that my mind was just playing tricks on me. I parked my RV on the opposite side of the lot, locked my doors, and tried to get some sleep. Then, at 2:47 a.m., I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had startled me. Everything was silent, the kind of deep silence that presses against your ears. Then I heard it, a soft tapping on my window. I froze. It was rhythmic, slow, tap, tap, tap. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. My heart pounded as I turned my head slightly, trying to see outside without making it obvious I was awake. That's when I saw the shadow. It was standing near the abandoned RV, barely visible in the darkness. A tall, thin figure, motionless, watching. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, the door handle to my RV started to move. Not violently, not like someone trying to break in. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone was testing it. That's when I lost it. I grabbed my keys, started the engine, and slammed my foot on the gas. Gravel flew as I sped toward the dirt road, my headlights cutting through the thick fog that had suddenly appeared. As I reached the main highway, I made the mistake of looking in my rearview mirror. The shadow was standing in the middle of the road. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I reached a gas station, where I sat in the driver's seat for nearly an hour, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, I asked a local if they knew anything about Ridgeview Campground. The old man behind the counter frowned. "Son, that place burned down in the 70s. They never rebuilt it." I showed him a picture of the road sign. His face went pale. "That's impossible. That sign was torn down years ago." I never went back to check. I never wanted to. If you ever find yourself driving through the back roads of California and see a sign for a place that shouldn't exist, don't stop. Don't investigate, just keep driving. I learned my lesson the hard way. You might not be as lucky. My name is Kevin Carter, and if you take one thing from this story, let it be this. Never take an RV trip through the remote highways of California alone. I thought I was just going on a peaceful road trip to clear my mind. Instead, I barely made it out alive. Back in 2018, I had just quit my job in San Francisco. Burned out and exhausted, I decided to take a solo RV trip through California. Just me, the open road, and a few weeks of exploring. I mapped out my route, heading south along the Pacific Coast Highway, then cutting inland to explore the national parks. Everything was going fine until I decided to take a detour. I was somewhere along Highway 395 near the Sierra Nevada mountains when I saw a faded wooden sign pointing to a remote campsite. It wasn't on my map, but I figured it was a hidden gem. a place where I could park my RV, sit by a fire, and enjoy the stars. The sign read, Blackwood Camp, 12 miles. It sounded peaceful. I should have turned around the moment I saw that sign. The road was terrible. Narrow, winding, full of potholes. My GPS lost signal almost immediately, but I wasn't too worried. After all, it was just 12 miles, but something was wrong. As I drove, I noticed the trees looked dead. Not like they had burned, but like they had been drained of life. No leaves, just twisted, blackened branches reaching toward the sky. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The road seemed too long. I checked my odometer. I had driven 18 miles. No campground, no signs. Just the endless, empty road. I told myself I must have missed the turnoff. I decided to keep going just a little farther. That's when I saw it. An RV. It was parked on the side of the road, old and rusted, covered in dirt like it had been sitting there for decades. The windows were broken, the door slightly open. My headlights barely illuminated the inside, but I saw enough. Shattered plates, torn clothing, something dark smeared on the walls. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been here, or worse, someone was still here. I hit the gas, my heart pounding. The road kept stretching on, twisting in directions that didn't make sense. I checked my odometer again, 24 miles. No turnoff, no signs of life. Just the road, the dead trees, and the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Then my headlights flickered. For a split second, everything went dark. My engine stuttered, and when my lights came back on, there was a figure standing in the road, tall, motionless, too thin. I swerved, nearly driving off the road. By the time I looked back, it was gone. I slammed my foot on the gas, praying I would find my way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the road ended. Not in a dead end, not in a campground, it just stopped. Ahead of me was nothing but a drop-off into darkness, a cliff, as if the road had never been finished. But my GPS had shown a full loop. There was supposed to be a way out. There was supposed to be something here. My headlights caught something on the ground, a rusted metal sign, half buried in dirt. I got out, my hand shaking, and brushed away the dust. Blackwood Camp, closed permanently, 1983. That was 35 years ago. I didn't stop to think. I threw the RV into reverse, speeding back the way I came. Every turn felt different, like the road was shifting beneath me. The trees seemed closer. The air felt heavier. Then I saw the RV again. But this time, the door was closed. And there were footprints leading away from it. Fresh ones. I didn't look. I didn't stop. I kept driving, refusing to blink, refusing to breathe, until finally, I saw a pair of headlights in the distance. I had made it back to the highway. When I pulled into a gas station hours later, I checked my GPS again. There was no record of Blackwood Camp, no turnoff, no side road, nothing. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know where I really was. But if you ever see a sign for a place that doesn't exist, a road that seems to stretch forever, an RV that looks like it's been waiting for you, turn around. Because if you don't, you might not come back. My name is Jacob Reed. Back in 2019, my friends and I planned what was supposed to be the perfect road trip, renting an RV and driving across California. Just 4 guys, the open road, and a list of places we wanted to explore. We had planned everything. Yosemite, Big Sur, Joshua Tree. But one bad decision changed everything. It was our 3rd night, and we were somewhere east of San Bernardino, heading toward the Mojave Desert. The plan was to find a campsite before it got too late, but we had miscalculated the driving time. It was close to midnight, and we were in the middle of nowhere, just an empty highway stretching into darkness. That's when we saw the sign. Silver Sky Campground, 5 miles. None of us had heard of it, but we were exhausted, and it seemed like our best option. The road leading to the campsite was a narrow dirt path that kicked up dust behind us. Our headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the further we drove, the quieter it got. No wind, no insects, nothing. When we arrived, something felt off. There were no other RVs, no tents, no signs of life. Just a few scattered picnic tables and a rusted fire pit. A small wooden sign read Silver Sky, but it looked decades old, the paint peeling away. Still, we were too tired to care. We parked, set up our sleeping bags inside the RV, and decided to call it a night. That's when the knocking started. At first, we thought it was the wind, but then we heard it again. A slow, deliberate knock on the RV door, 3 knocks. We froze. No one moved. Nick, the guy closest to the door, whispered, "Who the hell would be out here?" No one answered. Then, 3 more knocks. I grabbed my phone and checked the signal. No service, of course. Nick finally built up the courage to peek through the blinds. He gasped, "Guys, there's nobody there." We all stared at each other, our hearts pounding. We were in the middle of nowhere. There shouldn't be anyone out here. Then something hit the side of the RV, hard. A loud thud shook the vehicle, like someone had thrown a rock or a fist. We didn't wait to find out. Scrambling to the front seat, I started the engine and floored it. Dust kicked up as we sped back toward the highway. The second we hit the main road, everyone started talking at once, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then Mark, who had been looking out the back window, said something that made my blood run cold. "Guys, the sign's gone." We turned to look. The wooden Silver Sky sign we had passed just 20 minutes ago, it wasn't there anymore. No evidence of a campground, no road, just miles of empty desert behind us. We drove straight to the nearest gas station and pulled in, shaking. The clerk saw our faces and asked if we were okay. We told him what happened. He stared at us for a long time before saying, "Silver Sky?" That place burned down. In 1978. We left California the next morning. I don't know what we stumbled into that night. I don't want to know. But if you ever find yourself driving through California and you see a sign for Silver Sky Campground, keep driving. My name is Eric Lawson, and I made the worst mistake of my life in the summer of 2017. I'm not a superstitious guy. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that nonsense. Or, at least, I didn't until that trip. It started as a normal road trip. My girlfriend Jessica and our 2 best friends, Mike and Lauren, had planned a 2-week RV adventure across California. We wanted to hit all the major spots: Yosemite, Big Sur, Joshua Tree. The plan was simple: drive, camp, and enjoy the open road. But then we got greedy. We were 3 days into the trip somewhere near Death Valley. The original plan was to camp at a well-known site, Mesquite Dunes Campground. But around 5 p.m., while we were getting gas, an old man at the station overheard us and said, "You kids don't want to camp there. Too crowded. If you really want a peaceful night, there's an old spot about an hour west. Used to be a state campground, but no one goes there anymore." Looking back, we should have ignored him. But we were young and dumb and figured a secluded campsite sounded perfect. He gave us rough directions, warning us to leave before sunrise. That should have been the second red flag. We drove for about an hour, turning off the main highway onto an unmarked dirt road. It was long and bumpy, but eventually we found the place. a small deserted campsite surrounded by dead Joshua trees. There was no official sign, just a rusted metal pole where one must have once stood. I should have turned around then. But we were excited, so we parked the RV, set up a small fire, and started cooking. The sun dipped below the horizon, and soon it was pitch black. The silence was unnatural. No insects, no wind, just nothing. Around 11 p.m., as we sat by the fire, we heard something. A whistle. It was faint, distant, but definitely a whistle. 3 notes. High, low, high. Lauren laughed nervously. "Is that a bird?" No one answered. Then, from the opposite direction, we heard it again. High, low, high. Jessica grabbed my arm. "Eric, I don't like this." Mike, trying to be brave, stood up and shined his flashlight toward the trees. "Hello?" he called out. "Anyone there?" Silence. Then something moved. A shape, just beyond the fire's reach. Too tall to be an animal. It darted between the trees. I barely caught a glimpse, but I swear it was a person. Lauren gasped. "We need to go now." I wasn't about to argue. We grabbed what we could, ran into the RV, and locked the doors. Jessica was already in the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. That's when we heard the footsteps. Software, slow, circling the RV. Mike killed the lights. "Don't move," he whispered. For what felt like forever, we sat there in total silence. Then, a single knock on the RV door. Jessica whimpered, "Oh my God." Another knock, then another, and then the whistling, right outside the door. High, low, high. Jessica lost it. She slammed the RV into drive, peeling out so fast we nearly flipped. The tires kicked up dust as we sped down the dirt road, bouncing violently. In the rearview mirror, I saw figures standing in the road, at least 5. Tall, unmoving, just watching us leave. We didn't stop until we reached a highway rest stop an hour later. None of us spoke. We just sat there, shaking. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I tried looking up the campsite, but here's the thing. It doesn't exist. No record, no history, nothing. Just empty desert. I don't know who or what was out there that night. But if you ever take an RV trip in California and someone offers you a secret camping spot, don't take it. And if you ever hear that whistle, high, low, high, run.